Lieutenant Stanley Swede Vejtasa soared through the war-torn skies over the Santa Cruz Islands in his F4F Wildcat. It was mid-morning on October 26, 1942, and the 28-year-old sharpshooter was tasked with defending a vastly outnumbered U.S. carrier fleet against the relentless onslaught of Japanese bombers. Suddenly, he caught sight of the dark silhouette of a group of Val dive bombers looming above him. Gritting his teeth, he pulled back on the stick, forcing his Wildcat to climb. The engine strained, the aircraft shuddering as it ascended through the fog. At 12,000 feet, Vejtasa broke through the cloud cover, only to find himself wing to wing with the enemy. Vejtasa's heart pounded in his chest. He maneuvered his F4F behind the first bomber, fingers gripping the controls tightly, and squeezed the trigger. The Wildcat's 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns roared to life. Tracers streaked toward the enemy, the bomber shuddering under the impact. Smoke trailed from its engines as it spiraled down in a fiery descent. There was no time to celebrate. The battle was quickly spiraling into a disaster for the U.S. fleet. One carrier, USS Hornet, was a smoldering wreck after a brutal 20-minute assault that had claimed 118 American lives. Now, USS Enterprise was the United States' last operational carrier in the Pacific, and its only hope of rescuing the Marines stuck on Guadalcanal. Just then, a voice crackled in his headset. One of his fellow pilots had sighted a block of Japanese torpedo planes heading toward Enterprise. Vejtasa's eyes narrowed with determination. He and his comrades had to intercept them before they reached the carrier. Lieutenant Stanley Swede Vejtasa made aviation history on an iconic warplane, alongside many other renowned pilots. Today, the Wreckwatch's X4009 collection allows you to wear a little bit of that illustrious history on your wristwatch. 4 impressive timepieces from the X4009 collection are made from the aluminum of the Mark 1A Spitfire X4009. Piloted by the legendary Patterson Clarence Hughes, this aircraft played a pivotal role in the Battle of Britain, and the Hunter Fighter Collection in Australia is currently restoring its wreckage. Some of the unusable aluminum from the Spitfire has been turned by Wreckwatches into the subdial at 6 o'clock on each X4009 wristwatch. But every watch is different, with distinct dings and blemishes that convey a unique story of heroism and selflessness. They include aircraft silhouettes on the rotor and ribbon spar crown guards, along with powerful loom and Arabic numerals in bold font, and are modeled after military timepieces from World War II. Owning an X4009 is more than just wearing a piece of history. It's actively participating in preserving it, as part of every sale goes to the Hunter Fighter Collection Restoration Fund, ensuring the Spitfire Mark 1A X4009 is restored to its former glory. Head over to the Wreckwatches e-store and pre-order your own with a 25% discount to be delivered in October 2024. Secure your piece of history today at www.wreckwatches.com. Born on an isolated homestead in rural Montana on July 27, 1914, Stanley Winfield Swede Vejtasa developed a keen interest in aviation from a young age during the barnstorming days, when traveling pilots would perform aerial stunts and offer plane rides in small towns. One day, Vejtasa and his younger brother snuck into a plane, and armed only with a popular Mechanics magazine article titled How to Fly in One Easy Lesson, managed to take off and land in one piece. After attending Montana State College and the University of Montana, Vejtasa became an aviation cadet, earning his wings in July 1939 before being assigned to USS Yorktown as part of Scouting Squadron 5 the following month. Vejtasa's first taste of combat came in January 1942, taking part in some of the first American offensive strikes against the Japanese in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. By March, Task Force 17's target was Japanese shipping in the Huon Gulf on the northern coast of New Guinea. On the morning of March 10th, Vejtasa climbed into his Dauntless on a mission to bomb enemy ships to disrupt supply lines. Weaving his way through a web of heavy anti-aircraft fire, Vejtasa performed daring dive bomb attacks, contributing to the destruction of 3 Japanese vessels. His performance that day earned him a Navy Cross and a reputation among other pilots for his skill and courage. Yet on May 3rd, while en route to Port Moresby, Task Force 17 got wind of another invasion. Unexpectedly, the Japanese had taken Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, undefended at the time. Changing course without a moment to waste, the task force arrived the next morning to launch a series of surprise airstrikes against the Japanese ships in the area. Vejtasa and his rear gunner were part of the anti-torpedo patrols defending USS Yorktown. Suddenly, the group encountered a swarm of 12 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, which could fly a full 100 miles per hour faster than their SBD dive bombers. Unsurprisingly, the nimble Japanese aircraft began running rings around the cumbersome dive bombers. Vejtasa looked on nervously as several of his comrades were shot down out of the sky. Determined to outmaneuver the enemy fighters, Vejtasa performed a series of white-knuckle aerial stunts, generating tremendous positive G-forces that at times found his body weighing over 1,000 pounds, alternated with just as extreme negative G-forces that saw him floating in his straps. After 17 minutes of increasingly violent twists and turns, pushing the two men's bodies to the limit, Vejtasa wasn't sure how much more he could take. But when one of the Zeros overshot a turn, he seized his chance to pull up on its tail and deliver a powerful burst of gunfire, sending the fighter down in a cloud of thick black smoke. Vejtasa now had a one-on-one duel on his hands. The Japanese fighter turned and was now zooming toward him. With so many shots fired, Vejtasa wondered how the Zero had any ammunition left, but its cannon kept blazing. Frustrated by his inability to hit the SBD, the Japanese pilot resorted to a more drastic approach, launching a frenzied kamikaze attack on Vejtasa. With a combined closure rate of almost 500 miles per hour, it seemed certain that any contact between the two aircraft would destroy both of them. As the Zero barreled in, Vejtasa performed a vertical before rolling back. Just as he did so, he heard a loud bang. The enemy fighter had hit his wing. Vejtasa watched in horror as one of his ailerons went flying off. Miraculously, he survived the impact. For his outstanding exploits, Vejtasa was awarded a Gold Star instead of a Second Navy Cross, becoming the only naval aviator to have received this level of recognition for dive bombing and dogfight skills. On June 20th, 1942, the Navy created a new aerial unit, Fighting Squadron 10. The squadron was nicknamed the Grim Reapers, and they used the scythe-wielding skeletal figure as their emblem to reflect their mission to bring swift and certain destruction to the enemy. Having impressed his superiors with his dogfighting prowess, Swede Vejtasa was assigned to the new unit, trading in his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber for a Grumman F4F Wildcat fighter. Vejtasa had enjoyed flying the SBD, even writing a letter through official channels to suggest that it could be an effective fighter by removing some fuel tank space and adding extra guns. Now, he relished the opportunity to fly a real fighter. After a brief training period in San Diego, Vejtasa and the Grim Reapers were deployed with the carrier USS Enterprise, known as the Big E. In late August 1942, the squadron saw its first combat at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Vejtasa participated in a series of strikes on Japanese transports, attempting to send reinforcements to Guadalcanal. He later commented that the water turned red from the fighting and the sharks that arrived soon afterward. Enterprise took serious damage at the battle and was sent to Pearl Harbor for repairs. By mid-October, she was headed back toward the action in the South Pacific. After the first phase of the Guadalcanal campaign had seemingly ended in stalemate, the Japanese were now preparing to oust the U.S. Marine Corps from the island with a major land offensive. At the same time, the Imperial Japanese Navy would be on hand to deal with any Allied naval units that might try to get involved. In particular, the Japanese hoped to significantly weaken the Allies' position in the region by engaging and defeating Allied carrier forces. Among these was Task Force 61, which included Enterprise, the flagship of first-time Task Force Commander Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, and fellow carrier USS Hornet. By October 25th, the two carriers and their task groups were sweeping north of the Santa Cruz Islands, hunting for enemy ships. At 11:03 a.m., a PBY Catalina reconnaissance seaplane spotted the Japanese main body carriers around 355 nautical miles from the Allies, too far away to be engaged. Believing Enterprise could catch up, the inexperienced Admiral Kinkaid decided to steam ahead and ordered Vejtasa to hunt down and attack the Japanese fleet. Vejtasa was indignant. He knew there was no way they would make it, throwing down his plotting board in frustration. However, he had little choice but to follow orders, and the strike force reluctantly took to the skies in the late afternoon. Meanwhile, Japanese concerns about the U.S. patrol planes flying overhead grew, and the fleet moved further north. Despite Kinkaid being informed of this, he refused to recall Vejtasa's strike force, leaving them to conduct a wild goose chase. After an intense return flight that saw the squadron almost lose its way and the unfortunate demise of a Wildcat pilot whose aircraft lost power, the strike force neared the position where the Big E should have been. Much to their alarm, the carrier wasn't there. Kinkaid had abandoned them. Chaos ensued. with accidents caused by some of the force's SBDs attempting to expand their flying time by dropping their payloads, leading to 2 aircraft having to ditch. As the rest of the strike force pilots wondered what to do, Vejtasa suddenly had a brainwave. Remembering having noticed that morning that Enterprise was trailing oil, he headed down close to sea level to try and locate the oil slick. The strike force followed the oil for 49 miles until it reached the carrier. Yet, the day's challenges were far from over. Somehow, Vejtasa and another Wildcat pilot had failed to see one another and landed simultaneously on the narrow carrier deck. Luckily, they avoided hitting each other, but the mistake could have cost both men their lives. Shortly after, a dauntless pilot ignored a wave-off signal, resulting in a collision that wrecked his plane and another aircraft. The resulting debris forced 3 fuel-depleted Avengers to ditch into the water. Although most pilots and crew were rescued, the incident tragically led to the loss of 1 aviator, a crewman, 4 SBDs, 3 TBFs, and 1 Wildcat. Vejtasa laid the blame for the accident firmly at Kincaid's door. During the night, the Japanese headed back toward the U.S. fleet, and the next morning, scout planes from both sides identified the locations of the other side's ships. Thus, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands got underway. With the Enterprise task group temporarily under cover of a rain squall, the Japanese sent a horde of AHD-D3A dive bombers, which the Americans called VALs, zooming toward Hornet. Vejtasa and his group raced skyward to meet them. As the VALs began their dive, Vejtasa positioned himself behind the last in the line, tearing it to shreds with his 650 caliber guns, before taking out another bomber as it emerged from the mist. This wasn't enough to save the Hornet, as the Japanese landed several bombs on her flight deck, and even crashed a pair of damaged dive bombers into the carrier's stack in portside, causing severe damage that left her permanently knocked out of action. The United States' hopes in the Pacific were now pinned on the Big E. Their only operational carrier left in the theater was no longer hidden by the rain squall. If she were sunk, the Marines would face certain destruction on Guadalcanal, and the entire Pacific campaign would be in danger of failure. Vejtasa knew this all too well. As a radio message informed him of an Enterprise-bound block of Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, nicknamed Kates, he hurried to intercept them. He'd already shot down 2 Japanese aircraft while defending Hornet, and now it was time to protect his own ship. Hot on the tails of 4 Kates as they flew into a cloud bank, Vejtasa dropped down behind them and got the furthest left in his sights before letting off a solid blast from his Browning M2 machine guns to neutralize the enemy bomber. Next up was the group leader. Once again, the sharpshooting fighter pilot came up from underneath the Kate and sent it up in flames, bound for the ocean below. These victories were swiftly followed by 2 more, the 3rd Kate allowing him to join the elite ranks of dogfighters with Ace in a Day status, and the 4th signaling the total obliteration of the group he'd been following. But Vejtasa had no time to rest. Noticing another Kate torpedo bomber hurtling toward the Big E, he chased the enemy aircraft down. Despite getting a taste of Vejtasa's machine guns, the smoking Kate kept on going. Vejtasa was now running alarmingly low on ammunition, and the Kate was leading him right into Enterprise's anti-aircraft guns. If he wasn't careful, he'd be hit by friendly fire. As he prepared to use his precious last few bullets in an attempt to finish the enemy off, he witnessed the Kate cartwheel into the waves. Climbing as quickly as he could to avoid Enterprise's anti-aircraft fire, Vejtasa caught sight of yet another torpedo bomber bearing in for an attack on the carrier. Knowing he still had a few rounds left, Vejtasa went after the Kate, riddling it with ammunition. The Kate refused to go down. Vejtasa was contemplating flying into its tail to try and cut it off with his propeller, when suddenly the bomber took a dramatic nosedive, headed straight for USS Smith, one of Enterprise's destroyer escorts. Vejtasa could only look on in amazement as the Kate performed its brutal attack, smashing headfirst into Smith's bridge, causing the destroyer to burst into flames. Though 57 of her men lost their lives, Smith remarkably soldiered on. Once the fire had been put out, she returned to her position to continue providing anti-aircraft support. As the morning drew to a close, with both sides having suffered considerable damage, the 2 fleets retired, and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands was over. Swede Vejtasa was credited with downing 7 enemy aircraft during the engagement, becoming the first U.S. pilot to perform such a feat in a single mission. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Flatley, leader of the Grim Reapers, recognized the unprecedented nature of Vejtasa's achievement and recommended him for a Medal of Honor. However, Admiral Kincaid, perhaps still bitter about Vejtasa's criticism, and worried about drawing attention to his questionable strategic decisions, denied the pilot this accolade, offering the significantly lesser award of a Distinguished Flying Cross. Eventually, this was upgraded to a second Gold Star instead of a third Navy Cross, making Vejtasa one of the first aviators to achieve this recognition 3 times. Thank you to Rec Watches for sponsoring our video. Honor the legacy of aviation heroes with the X4009 collection. Pre-order now at 25% off at www.recwatches.com and be a part of history.